One characteristic of people with integrity is the ability to care for others and to foster good relationships. Caring for others is more than having sympathetic feelings for them. It requires that one take concrete action to look after the needs of others. Caring for others and fostering good relationships go together for two reasons. First, humans are essentially social creatures. We live and work in groups, and most of us would be absolutely miserable if we didn't have meaningful relationships. So caring about persons means caring about their relationships. We cannot accomplish many of the tasks we need to undertake unless we can foster good relationships. This includes the task of giving care to others. Let's start with an example and see how caring works. Doug is concerned with trying to salvage an account and wants to send someone to visit the client. Tuan is the most likely candidate since he has a good working relationship with the client. But he is scheduled to visit another client on a much bigger account. Susan has some experience with this client and has been known to save accounts in similar situations, so she is Doug's first choice. Carlos is a possibility, but he is not as familiar with the product as Susan. Doug recalls that Susan's father is in the last stages of his battle with congestive heart failure, and he wonders whether it would be fair to ask her to go. He calls her into his office, and Susan says that her father would probably want her to go. Satisfied, Doug sends Susan on the trip, but the account is lost anyway. Did Doug do the right thing? We can now answer this question by asking whether Doug was sufficiently caring. What is care? Care is a basic human capacity to recognize and respond to the needs of others and to moderate our behavior by appeal to the good or harm it might cause to others. Martin Hoffman is a prominent moral psychologist who sees care as growing out of our natural capacity for empathy. This capacity is evident even in newborns who cry when they hear another baby cry. Later in their development, children come to be motivated to help whenever they encounter others in distress. Finally, reflection allows us to build on our basic empathic distress at the suffering of others. We can then generalize beyond our immediate experience of someone's distress and imagine the distress of someone who is distant from us. In both cases, we feel impelled to help. This impulse to help can be undermined in a number of ways: by blaming the victim for his own distress, by feeling overwhelmed by the distress of others, and by consciously avoiding the awareness of the distress of others. Further, we have a natural impulse to prioritize the needs of those who are close to us. Hoffman points to the natural, evolutionary basis for empathy, but suggests that we can use this natural capacity to motivate us to be responsive to distant others as well, as long as we make a conscious commitment to be caring persons. Because there is a natural basis for care, care as a moral perspective can be both a strong motivation for doing the right thing and can provide a basis for recognizing right actions. We've seen then that moral perspectives can be connected to basic human capacities. Another way to think about moral perspectives is to see them as growing out of ideal ways to respond in a certain context. For example, if one thinks about what is involved in doing one's moral best in the context of a marketplace between relatively independent and self-interested strangers, the value of honesty and trust are central. The care perspective in moral philosophy grew out of looking systematically at what is required to be a responsible member of a flourishing relationship. Sarah Ruddick, for example, looked carefully at what is involved in being a good mother to dependent children. Many contemporary defenders of an ethic of care, and many historical antecedents, such as David Hume and Adam Smith, think that one can generalize beyond relationships with our intimates. Thus, once we find out what values motivate a person to be an ideal, caring person in an intimate relationship, one can apply those values to situations that involve distant strangers. When one understands what practice best allows us to apply these values in intimate relationships, then one can generalize these practices to other situations. Though not all defenders of an ethic of care see care as a virtue, I think this is the most plausible way to understand it. Like other virtues, care is a general disposition to behave in a particular way. Unlike other virtues, care is what I call a meta-virtue. That is, it provides an organizing principle for all the other virtues. If my overall orientation is to be a caring person, then I will be courageous when what I value is at risk. I will be honest because honesty is usually the best way to care for others. I will want to be prudent because I recognize that I must balance the needs of others and my own needs. So the traditional virtues of courage, honesty, and prudence are organized under the meta-virtue of care. When Carol Gilligan first described the care orientation, she described it as a typically female moral orientation. However, there is nothing gendered about caring. If it is more prevalent in women than in men, it is because women are socially conditioned to do much of society's caring work. They are more likely to be involved with caring for children and the sick, for example. Care is a basic human capacity, and as such, it is both possible and important for all of us to be caring persons. Developing one's capacity in giving care requires that we commit to this ideal and that we have practice exercising care. When we truly care about someone or something, we have certain emotions and motivations. If we see someone in dire need, for example, we will feel compassion and be motivated to do something to respond to the need. Finally, it is not enough to merely have the appropriate emotion and motivation. Care involves an appropriate response. Caring is a response to the variety of features of moral situations: need, harm, past promises, role relationships, etc. In the case of need, our obligation to respond in an appropriately caring way arises when we are able to respond to need. We can roughly distinguish needs here from desires by describing a need as something that is basic to our survival and minimally decent life, as opposed to something that we merely want. Humans need some things for their very survival. Food, clothing, shelter, and health care are examples here. There are also other things that we need for a minimally decent life. Aristotle cites friendship, Mill cites liberty, and Rawls offers self-esteem as a need in this sense. Still, there is no universal, cross-cultural understanding of need. Rather, need is mediated by a number of factors, including family, culture, economic class, gender and sexuality, disability, and illness. Finally, as we respond to needs, we should recognize the vast differences in power that exist. Sometimes people are unwilling to express their needs freely because they fear that their needs will not be met. They may even be in such a state of dependence or despair that they are no longer able to identify their needs. Need is not the only feature of moral situations. Harm, for example, is an important one to consider. Most people understand that being the cause of harming someone else creates an obligation to respond. But causation is a complex idea. We can be part of the causal story even when we don't think of ourselves as the primary cause. Suppose, for example, that you see the person sitting next to you in an exam cheating. Suppose further that this is an exam that is designed to demonstrate competence in a skill crucial for a healthcare practitioner. Suppose that you simply look the other way and later find out that a patient was seriously harmed because the practitioner really did not understand the procedure they should have followed, and that this procedure was the very one they were being tested on when you saw them cheating. Do you have a responsibility here? We would argue that you do, though it's not always clear what you can do after the fact. At the very least, you now have a reason for not looking the other way when you see similar cheating in the future. There are two other things that mark the moral dimension of a situation that are worth noting here: past promising and role responsibility. When we make a promise, we commit ourselves to a certain course of action. An ethic of care doesn't say that you are always committed to keeping a promise, because sometimes doing so can be harmful to all concerned. But it does impose a moral obligation to respond. Similarly, being in a particular role, a teacher for example, comes with a set of general obligations. We've now looked at some of the features of situations that suggest that we have an obligation. In order to see what our obligations are in a particular situation, we need to look at the features of an ethic of care. Though humans have always appealed to features of care in their interactions with each other, it emerged only recently as a systematic moral perspective. Nell Nodding's very influential book, Caring: A Feminine Approach to Ethics and Moral Education, was the first contemporary work that described care in some detail as a moral orientation. Virginia Held has also been an influential defender for this perspective, who has most recently extended the perspective to the global arena. There are important differences and similarities in the different descriptions of an ethic of care, but here I will be using the model that I have developed. There are four central ideas in an ethic of care: moral attention, sympathetic understanding, relationship awareness, and harmony and accommodation. Moral attention is the attention to the situation in all its complexity. When one is morally attentive, one wishes to become aware of all the details that will allow a sympathetic response to the situation. It is not enough to know that this is a case of a particular kind, say a case about lying or cruelty. In order to understand what our obligations are, we have to know all the details that might make a difference in our understanding and response to the particular situation at hand. When one sympathetically understands the situation, one is open to sympathizing and even identifying with the person in the situation. One tries to be aware of what the other in the situation would want one to do, what would most likely be in their interests, and how they would like one to carry out their wishes and interests and meet their needs. I call this attention to the best interests of others maternalism. It is done in the context of a special sensitivity to the wishes of the other and with an understanding of the other's interest that is shaped by a deep sympathy and understanding. When it is hard to be sympathetic, one may try several strategies, perhaps imagining others as oneself in an earlier crisis. As one adopts this sympathetic attitude, one then becomes aware of what others want and need. Finally, as we respond to others, we look to satisfy their needs in ways that will preserve their sense of competence and dignity, while at the same time addressing their needs or responding to their suffering or otherwise fulfilling our obligations towards them. There is a special kind of relationship awareness that characterizes caring. A person recognizes that others are in a relationship with him. First, there is the most basic relationship, that of fellow creatures. Second, there is the immediate relationship of need and ability to fill the need. Third, we note the past promises or interactions that generate obligation. Finally, one may be in some role relationship with the other that calls for a particular response, such as teacher-student. One is aware of all these relationships as he surveys a situation from the perspective of care. But there is another kind of relationship awareness that is involved as well. One can be aware of the network of relationships that connect humans and care about preserving and nurturing these relationships. As caring persons think about what to do, they try not to undermine these relationships, but rather to nurture and extend the relationships that are supportive of human flourishing. Related to the notion of a relationship awareness is accommodation. Oftentimes there are many persons involved, and how best to help is not obvious. The desire to nurture networks of care requires that one tries to accommodate the needs of all, including oneself. It is not always possible or wise to do what everyone thinks they need, but it is often important to do what you think is best, while at the same time giving everyone concerned a sense of being involved and considered in the process. When we do this, we have a better chance of preserving harmony. If you do what you think is right without consulting anyone, you risk upsetting the harmony of the group. Of course, not all harmony is worth preserving. The oppressive society may be pretty stable and harmonious, but at the price of ignoring those at the bottom. An ethic of care would be opposed to this type of superficial harmony, since it is dependent on treating some as though they do not deserve the same care as others. Ideally, we should aim for the harmonious society in which all are treated with care. Let's return to Doug and see how he might have thought about the situation if he'd been more skillful at caring. Doug did not really think about Susan's situation very carefully. He should have realized that she was very upset about her father's illness. Since we are all distracted when something this serious is going on in our lives, she was probably also worried that her concern might put her job performance in jeopardy. Doug should not have taken her words at face value, because it's hard to believe that her father really wanted her to go. Perhaps he was just being a good father and trying to put Susan's needs above his own. Very likely, he was worried about how his illness was affecting her and might have told her to go to give her some time off or protect her job. Doug also did not give much thought to how well Susan would be able to interact with the client while her father was dying miles away. The result of his action was a lost account and considerable discomfort for Susan. This lack of care on his part probably will affect his relationship with Susan and her effectiveness in future negotiations. Whenever she has to go visit a client, she will be reminded of that very precious time she lost with her father. Doug should have given more thought to finding other alternatives to send Susan on the trip during this very trying time. Moral reasoning. Now that we've seen how the care perspective works, let's turn to a brief history. Carol Gilligan's pioneering work, In a Different Voice, was the first systematic attempt to describe the voice of care and to distinguish it from what she called the voice of justice. Since then, psychologists and philosophers have been busy elucidating the central concepts and testing for various aspects of the two voices. Gilligan began by responding to the views of Lawrence Kohlberg, who developed a theory about how people reason and develop morally. His theory of moral reasoning posited that people reason morally by applying principles to cases, thus yielding judgments about what they ought to do. Moral development on Kohlberg's account is cognitive and proceeds to progressively more general principles, with ideal moral development culminating in principles that are universal and binding on all persons. Carol Gilligan noted that Kohlberg's subjects, though culturally diverse, were all male. She began to apply his tests to female subjects of various ages. Her conclusion was that some people, notably females, appealed to what she called a care voice, in contrast to the principle-based justice voice of Kohlberg. The care voice involves a thorough understanding of the context and a willingness to balance the needs of self and other in a way that preserves both. For Gilligan, moral development was thus both cognitive and emotional. The growth in the ability to see the situation from the perspective of self and other, and to care about oneself as well as others. She illustrated the differences in moral reasoning with two 11-year-olds, Jake and Amy. Jake and Amy are both given Kohlberg's Heinz dilemma to solve. Heinz is a druggist who has invented a drug to combat cancer. Heinz's wife needs the drug, but Heinz does not have the money to buy it, and the druggist will not give it to him. The children, Jake and Amy, are asked whether Heinz should steal the drug. Jake quickly answers affirmatively and defends his answer by appealing to the relative importance of life over property. Amy begins by saying that it depends. She points out that all the things that could go wrong if Heinz steals the drug. Perhaps he will get caught and go to jail, and his wife will be worse off. She suggests instead that Heinz and the druggist should sit down and work it out to everyone's satisfaction. Jake fits easily into Kohlberg's schemata. He imagines himself in Heinz's position and applies a principle that quickly yields an answer. He does not need any more information about Heinz, the druggist, Heinz's wife, etc. Amy, on the other hand, is virtually impossible to analyze on Kohlberg's scale because she never states or even employs a principle that will yield an answer. Instead, as she imagines herself in Heinz's shoes, she sees the complexity of the situation and realizes that its solution requires that Heinz and the druggist and Heinz's wife recognize their involvement in a relationship, and that they honor this awareness by working out a solution that will enable them all to survive and, if possible, flourish. For Jake, the solution is cognitive. Heinz merely reasons about the situation and can take action on the basis of that reasoning. Amy sees a real solution as necessarily involving growth in moral sensitivity and commitment. At this point in the discussion of an ethic of care, I want to make a meta-ethical point. I am not convinced that in some ethically preferred world, everyone would adopt the same moral theory or the same way of dealing with the moral realities of life. I am certainly not convinced that in this world everyone can do so. Rather, I think that each moral theory has insight to offer and sheds light on a different aspect of our moral lives. I also think that each of us has a particular history and moral narrative that limits our ability to adopt new moral perspectives, regardless of how we may evaluate one moral theory against another. Finally, I think that when we try to make moral theories guides to action in the rough and tumble world of complex and difficult choices, we ought to take comfort where and when we can. If one particular moral theory sheds new light on a difficult and novel issue, then we should comb it for every bit of insight we find useful. It is for these reasons that I prefer to speak of moral perspectives rather than moral theories. It is also important to distinguish between an ethic of care and an ethical approach to caregiving. One need not subscribe to an ethic of care as a moral perspective to realize that there are special issues that arise for any of us in our various roles as caregivers. I think that an ethic of care will shed light on a range of issues, certainly including the ethics of caregiving, but I am not committed to the view that moral perspectives are necessarily incompatible. They are often complementary. Care and Confucian ethics are similar in some important respects. Ideal humanness, Shen, and propriety, Li, play a central role in Confucian ethics. Zhen is analogous to some important respects to care, while Li, like accommodation, reminds us that the good society must value harmony among its members. I think that an ethic of care provides a corrective to some other ways of thinking about caring for patients, for example. Kantian and utilitarian approaches are often seen as the gold standard in discussions of health care, but they are not quite up to every task. Patient autonomy and patient rights have a distinctly Kantian pedigree. We value patient autonomy because we see humans as rational moral agents who ought to be treated as ends in themselves and never merely as means. Patient rights provide the framework for our interactions with these autonomous persons. But if we rely exclusively on this perspective, we may lose sight of patients as needing care. When we are sick, we may not be up to the task of asserting our rights, and while we may value our autonomy, we also value being cared for. Utilitarianism is most useful at the macro level in discussions of social issues, reminding us of problems of cost and allocation. Care reminds us never to lose sight of actual persons. There will be times when a care model appears to be in tension with a moral rights perspective. One obvious example comes from bioethics. The patient's rights conception of the autonomous, competent patient is quite remote from the care conception of patients as primarily persons in need of maternal assistance. Still, these models can often work in tandem, and in my opinion, ought to be so wedded. Care and rights should be fundamental values. We envision the marriage of justice and care in the following way. First, we must be sensitive to the self-understanding of those entrusted to our care. Second, respecting rights is a moral minimum below which we ought not to fall, but care is the moral ideal. Respecting rights, then, is a minimal moral requirement, but we have not completely discharged our responsibilities until we treat others in a genuinely caring way. There is a further amendment to the rights model that must be made to make this a successful marriage. We should no longer assume that everyone is always capable of asserting and defending their rights in an autonomous way. Rather, we should recognize that sometimes people might be in need of care while temporarily, and in some cases permanently, unable to assert and defend their rights. In this case, we care for them and see returning them to full autonomy as part of our obligation rather than as an assumption about their present status. One helpful way to connect moral theories is to notice that they each focus primarily on a different component of our moral experience. Utilitarianism and other consequential views invite us to be sensitive to the consequences of our decisions and actions. Kant reminds us of two things. First, our motivation, and not just the outcomes of our actions, are morally significant. Second, persons have a special place in the moral hierarchy. Moral rights provide a way of understanding the implications of this special place in the moral hierarchy. Virtue theories focus not just on actions, but on the agents who are responsible for these actions. It directs our attention to the character traits that underlie our action and our commitments. It also focuses our attention on how concepts of the good life both anchor our views about the good society and grow out of particular societies. An ethic of care adds yet another dimension. It reminds us of the importance of human relationships. It places moral value on communities as well as persons, and asserts that our actions take place in the context of relationship. Our decisions should consider existing relationships and are often carried out via social action. Doing the right thing and living the morally good life must be understood in the context of trust, reciprocity, and concern for others. Decision procedure for an ethic of care. 1. Direct your moral attention to others. 2. Be open to sympathetic understanding. 3. Be aware of the need to sustain and preserve networks of care. 4. Act on the basis of this process. 5. Shortcut to action. What would my ideal, caring self do?